Surface parking is a scourge and a problem for downtowns. It takes up a lot of real estate, doesn't bring in the taxes or revenues that a business or residence would, and it's just plain ugly. But parking is an absolute necessity in our modern era of downtown commerce, and municipalities struggle with how to best deal with it. A lot of downtown development planning nowadays focuses on alternatives, like parking decks. Here in Birmingham, we've been ahead of that curve for several decades, or about 70 years. The first parking structure was built in the 1950s, and it helped not just the business that it was built for, Jacobson's department store, but also laid the groundwork for the retail shopping scene in Birmingham as we know it today. This is the story of Nathan Rosenfield, the savvy businessman who brought the much-loved Jacobson's department store to Birmingham in the mid-20th century, and who have forever changed the landscape of downtown. This is Birmingham Uncovered, a podcast by the Birmingham Museum, where we are exploring the diverse and compelling lives that built Birmingham, Michigan into the community that it is today. First, some background on Birmingham. We are a city of approximately 20,000 people over 4.73 square miles, approximately halfway between Detroit and Pontiac in Oakland County. This area was occupied by members of the Three Fires Confederacy of Indigenous People before white settlement in the area started in the late 18-teens. Birmingham became a city in 1933, and today is known as a prosperous and multifaceted community with a thriving cultural scene. If you, like me when I started here first, have no idea what Jacobson's was, let me give you a quick little history lesson about it. The store began in the village of Reed City in central Michigan in 1868 by Abraham Jacobson. Abraham and one of the subjects of our last podcast, Morris Levinson, had a lot in common. Abraham Jacobson was part of the wave of Jewish immigration to the United States in the mid to late 1800s from Eastern Europe. Like Morris and his parents, Abraham Jacobson settled in a booming lumber town. Reed City is located in Osceola County in Michigan's northeast-ish. Today, the city has a population of about 2,400 people, but in the 1860s, it was a booming town that sprang up at the junction of two major railroads. It had several mills along the river cutting wood, processing wool, and grinding flour. And the city could send those goods via rail to Michigan's bigger commercial centers. There was money to be made in Reed City, both in the lumber business and the businesses that catered to those entrepreneurs. And once folks start making money, they need nicer things to go along with it. Abraham Jacobson bet that folks in northern Michigan would like to buy the same sort of goods that they could buy in an upscale store in a place like New York City. And that bet paid off. His retail store grew so successful that Moses Jacobson, Abraham's son, took part of the inventory on the road. Moses traveled the state advertising the famous Jacobson merchandise and held trunk sales in hotels. While on the road, Moses saw the importance of railroads and delivering goods and people around. He also realized that there were bigger cities that had advantages that Reed City simply didn't have. For starters, Reed City, while on a railroad line, didn't have any direct service to big cities like Detroit or Chicago. Additionally, once the lumber industry had used up the natural resources in the area, there wasn't much else to propel the economy of the place. Abraham Jacobson died in 1892, and his sons Moses and William moved to Jackson, Michigan, 162 miles southeast. In 1904, they opened a store called M.I. Jacobson and incorporated it as Jacobson's Inc. in 1924. In 1919, the store opened in a new, larger building in Jackson, and the building matched the fanciness of the goods on offer with ivory fittings and blue carpeted floors. 2 years later, the store had 3 more locations in Battle Creek, Saginaw, and Ann Arbor. But in 1929, Moses died of a heart attack, leaving the company to his brother William. Just a few years later, in 1936, William also had to step away from the business due to a battle with heart disease, leaving management to his son Richard, whose heart, pun intended, just wasn't in the running of the business. And here you might be thinking, wait a minute, the 1930s are Great Depression times. How is a store that sells fancy and luxury goods going to survive the Great Depression? And as always, listeners, y'all ask the best questions. The Great Depression lasted between 1929 and 1939. And the stock market crash on October 24th, 1929 is traditionally the beginning date. Although it should be mentioned that economic instability was evident throughout the 1920s, as risky investment and speculation was rampant, and many small banks and communities all over the country failed. Once in full swing, the Great Depression was felt worldwide as prices on international markets fell sharply, leading to mass unemployment and political instability. An economic aside, in a previous episode on E.A. O'Neill, we mentioned the Great Depression before the Great Depression that occurred in 1870. That depression was a bit more contained because international trade hadn't yet picked up to the levels that we would see in the 20th and 21st centuries. In 1870, it was still fairly rare to go to a store and buy goods made across the ocean, and if you did, those goods were generally more expensive. But markets had become much more globally interrelated by the 1930s, which has become a part of our everyday life almost 100 years later. The impact of the 1930s depression on discretionary purchasing in the United States was dramatic. General unemployment rose to 23%. You might be tempted to think that small, locally owned stores might weather the storm better, that their communities might rally around them, and that their smallness might make them more nimble in changing market conditions. And you also might naturally assume that a store selling fancy or luxury goods would founder. But the data suggests a very different story. Larger stores that were part of a chain had a much better chance of surviving the Depression than small business establishments. And by this point, American department store chains like Macy's and Woolworths were rapidly expanding into many communities, giving shoppers predictability when it came to layouts and what goods they could find and how much those goods would cost. The scale at which these larger chain stores could purchase goods gave them an advantage over smaller stores, and the chain stores had more assets at their disposal to continue buying at scale. These chain stores could also better afford to continue paying their employees their previous wages, when smaller stores were cutting their employees' wages, giving the employees at these larger stores greater incentive to be productive. Jacobson's was one of the many chains to emerge from the Great Depression ready for their next chapter. In 1939, it was taking in about $300,000 in sales annually, which is about $6.5 million today. And it was the foremost retailer in women's apparel in its 4 locations. And in that year, the chain was sold to Nathan Rosenfield. Nathan Rosenfeld was born in 1903 in Philadelphia to Hungarian immigrants. He was a graduate of Wharton School of Business and had extensive retail experience, but he hungered for a chain of stores of his own. He would also bring his brother Zola into the business with him. He wasn't content with the store's 4 locations either, eyeing new markets in Michigan, including the Metro Detroit market dominated by Hudson's. At that time, Jacobson's business model focused on the upscale shopper who lived within close driving distance of a large downtown area. Birmingham fit that bill, and there was precedent for local shoppers responding positively to a department store. Check out our previous episode on Giddle and Morris Levinson for more info on Birmingham's first department store. In November 1950, about a decade after Levinson's closed, Birmingham's Jacobson store opened at the corner of Maple and Bates, where there had been a disused lot with a vacant gas station. And Birmingham's downtown was forever changed. For starters, that corner was then part of Birmingham's business section, dominated by offices, and the only parking was for the workers at those offices. There were no retail customer parking, because there wasn't a need for it. But Nathan Rosenfeld had a plan. As stated, Jacobson's business model centered upon strong downtowns. Jacobson's was so committed to this plan that when the city of Jackson had to discontinue their bus service in the city due to costs, Jacobson shouldered much of the expense until the city could resume providing transportation. Most of their customers didn't even take the bus, but Rosenfeld knew that public transportation kept the downtown thriving, and a thriving downtown meant a thriving Jacobson's. Most of Jacobson's customers arrived at their stores by car. Gone were the days of taking trunks of goods from town to town by train, as Moses Jacobson had done, or customers coming into town to shop at a department store by train or horse-drawn wagon, like customers at Birmingham's first department store had done. When he came to Birmingham, Nathan Rosenfield reached a deal with the city to go halvesies on much-needed infrastructure, a parking deck. It would be a win-win. Jacobson shoppers would have easy and convenient parking, promoting more spending, and the city would be able to attract more folks to its downtown, and thus attract more commercial businesses too. The gamble paid off. In a 1958 December advertisement in the Birmingham Eccentric newspaper, the city boasts that Birmingham is a shopping magnet where people can shop safely and comfortably, with parking for 4,000 vehicles between the new parking structure and other lots. Jacobson's realized a simple truth when it came to parking. Structures allow for more dense parking than surface lots, and are attractive to drivers because they offer protection from the elements. And nobody likes walking through a huge surface lot. Today, the city has 5 structures, with capacity for over 3,500 vehicles, along with 1,200 metered parking spaces and several surface lots. Jacobson's lot? It still exists as the North Old Woodward parking structure. Many folks who live in Birmingham and the surrounding area still refer to it as the Jacobson's parking deck. But Jacobson's story is much bigger than just the parking structure. Birmingham was booming in the 1950s, as shown by the rate of school building, which is a handy metric to judge just how fast a population is growing. In this case, literally growing. Between 1940 and 1960, the number of families with 3 children doubled, and the number with 4 children quadrupled. And that meant that Birmingham District needed more schools. Thanks to district voters' strong support of operating millage campaigns and bond issues, 17 new schools, primarily elementary schools, were built between 1950 and 1968. And how does this relate to Jacobson's success? Jacobson's core demographic was women, and the company's upper management realized that women bought home goods and children's clothing at the same time they shopped for themselves, and that this could lead to their children becoming loyal Jacobson shoppers down the line. When it opened in 1950, Jacobson's initial offerings in Birmingham were the women's apparel store, but quickly grew to include the Miss J shop for teens and young women, the fabric shop, the home decorative shop, the studio of fine arts, the beauty studio, the children's shop, and the shop for men. To accommodate this expansion, Jacobson's acquired adjacent properties, and the various shops were spread between them. Jacobson's encouraged their salespeople to guide customers to exactly what they needed, even if they had to guide them up or across the street to the other store locations. Jacobson's wasn't just for shopping either. It featured regular fashion shows throughout the latter 20th century, displaying the season's new looks, and often used local women, teens, and children as models. Designers like Yves Saint Laurent, Givenchy, Christian Dior, and Liz Claiborne were represented, as well as up-and-coming fashion designers like Stephen Burrows. Burrows was the first Black American designer embraced by the mainstream upper-class consumer after his spring and winter lines were carried by Jacobson's in 1974. His lettuce-leaf hems in striking and vibrant colors defined an era, and Jacobson's was one of the few places to get his looks in the Midwest. Although no Jacobson store was technically designated as its flagship store, Birmingham was considered its flagship store. Famous designers like Calvin Klein, who visited in 1973, made sure to make appearances at the store. Jacobson's wedding shows were a favorite as well. Brides and their entourages could view the season's latest designer offerings for brides, bridesmaids, and flower girls. Didn't see anything that spoke to you? You could get a dress and your accessories custom made at Jacobson's bridal shop. The store even sent someone to you on your wedding day to help you dress if you bought a gown from them. And your wedding dress could make it into the Birmingham Museum's collection 50 years later. Eileen Hitz, for example, purchased her gown for her November 1970 wedding at the Birmingham Jacobson's location and had a headpiece, veil, and train made to match. Attending a wedding and need a unique gift? Why not a genuine Pablo Picasso? The gift that every young couple needs. The Fine Arts Studio featured original pieces ranging from paintings to sculptures from world-renowned artists for you to choose from. If you weren't sure about the happy couple's taste in art, you could pop into the 35,000 square foot home store and buy anything from a full dining room to writing stationery. The home store was also where you could buy the very best items for home entertaining, and staff could show you exactly what you needed to host the perfect party. They could even send you home with recipes. Every year, the children's shop hosted the big man himself, Santa Claus. The children's shop carried everything from shoes, children's clothing, and of course, toys. Several nights a year during the holiday season were reserved for different groups of shoppers seeking something for that special person on their list. One night a year was reserved for men to come in and get help shopping for their partners and families. I'm not saying that Jake started the whole trend of sitcom dad didn't know what his wife or children like, but if you found yourself fitting into that trope, they were more than happy to assist you. Speaking of men, Jacobson's realized soon-ish that men also enjoyed looking good. In 1963, they opened their shop for men. More of a DIYer than buyer? Jacobson's held regular events called Do, where teens could weave cloth, paint, and create their own art. The Create Your Own Dress contest asked girls in the size range of 4 to 14 to submit a drawing of their dream dress, along with fabric ideas, and the winner would have a custom dress made just for her. The 1984 winner was 4th grader Mara Meyerson, who got to walk the catwalk in the spring fashion show in her custom gray taffeta dress. Like the idea of DIY, but just don't have the skills? No problem. Jacobson's on-hand designers like Ilka Suarez could hand knit or sew whatever you desired. Thinking more along the lines of a custom needlepoint? No problem. Like Jewel Anderson, who was a fan of Beatrix Potter, you could request a custom needlepoint of the character Jeremy Fisher holding a fishing rod, and have it turned into a custom purse. Then, you could donate it many years later to the Birmingham Museum to display in its Jacobson's exhibit. Additionally, twice a year a silhouette artist visited the store, and they created special mementos for shoppers. But Jacobson's wasn't just a haven for shoppers. It had a reputation for being a good employer as well. Each store had slightly different goods available, which meant that store buyers for each location had latitude for getting to know their customers and tailoring the wares that the store sold accordingly. Store management, instead of being shuffled around to different locations like other chains did, was encouraged to become a part of their community. Employee turnover was kept low, as many employees reported that they felt listened to and respected. Women were both the majority of Jacobson's shoppers and also its employees. This was quite different than the employment climate for women in general. In the early to mid-1900s, a woman could automatically be let go from their work if they married and or had children, but Jacobson's allowed them to stay on. Women also found great promotional opportunities at Jacobson's. In the Birmingham location, for instance, many of the various managers were women, at a time when few women were able to claw their way into management positions elsewhere. So what went wrong for this most bougie of department stores? And how did an entity that survived the Great Depression not make it to the present day? To answer that, we need to revisit the 1980s. In 1982, Nathan Rosenfield died. His death wasn't the only thing working against the store, though. Apparel buying patterns were changing. So were dress codes for workplaces. Business casual was taking over from the former tailored looks that Jacobson specialized in. The store decided to add more locations throughout the Midwest and Florida, and tried to court new customers by opening locations in malls and holding sales. Traditionally, Jacobson's hadn't held sales or offered coupons, out of the belief that it ruined the customer's faith in the value of the item on sale. And while having a sale might seem like a good way to get new bodies in the door while holding on to existing customers, these tactics turned off their existing customer base, and it was too little, too late to bring in new shoppers. Fast forward to 2001. Even though then President George W. Bush told Americans to go shopping in the wake of 9/11, and for you younger listeners, that absolutely happened, and I am not exaggerating for comedic effect, the losses that had been piling up on Jacobson's were too great to overcome, even by a grieving and confused nation seeking solace in retail therapy. Bankruptcy hovered. No buyers could be found for the Jacobson's chain either. Traditional retail chains were floundering at the same time that the dot-com bubble was bursting, scaring off potential buyers. In 2002, Jacobson's closed all of its locations for good. But the Jacobson's experience still exists here at the Birmingham Museum. At the museum, we have a semi-permanent exhibit that recreates the atmosphere of the store. And not a week goes by where we don't hear stories from former shoppers or employees bemoaning the loss of the store. It left a gaping hole in the lives of many, and also in many of the downtowns where the stores were located. I only half joke that we'd have a riot on our hands if we ever replaced the Jacobson's exhibit. We have visitors that come from all over just to see it. Luckily in Birmingham, the downtown that Jacobson's helped nourish for over 50 years meant that new tenants for its former locations were quickly found. Customers already used to coming to downtown Birmingham found other stores to visit, while still enjoying the 2 hours of free parking at the city's parking structures that Jacobson's helped bring in. The availability of parking and the flow of shoppers meant that smaller stores could move in and get a foothold that they might not have been able to find elsewhere. As we discussed at the end of last episode with Levinson's department store, downtown Birmingham no longer has a department store or a chain department store. The retail landscape focuses on smaller, often local boutique shops. In particular, the demand for women's apparel is strong, with over 19% of downtown businesses focusing on that category. Jewelry and watches constitute 15%, furniture and home 13%, and men's apparel 11%. The more things change, the more they sometimes stay the same. I think of Nathan Rosenfield as a bit like our previous podcast episode subject, Benjamin Pierce. Pierce is often cited as Birmingham's founder, even though he maybe only visited briefly once or twice. Nathan visited Birmingham much more often. His son recounts over 100 times just for the parking proposals. But otherwise, his home was in Jackson, Michigan. Both Pierce and Rosenfeld, though, have legacies that are still felt today. Next episode, we'll talk about a local entrepreneur and war hero who used the increased traffic that Jacobson's brought to downtown Birmingham to refocus and expand his business. Harris Makis started out as a horseboy working at his parents' bakery, who would soon grow into a restaurant mogul who changed the restaurant landscape forever, as well as becoming embroiled in one of Metro Detroit's most intriguing mysteries. For a full transcript of this episode and to see photos and other documents related to Jacobson's department store, check out our website. The link is in the show notes. For questions, comments, or episode suggestions, please feel free to reach out to us at museum@bhamgov.org. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a rating and review, as that makes it easier for other folks to find us. For more info on the Birmingham Shopping District and to see their upcoming events, check out their website, allinbirmingham.com. The link will also be in our show notes. I'm Caitlin Donnelly, and thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Birmingham Uncovered. Special thanks to the Birmingham Area Cable Board for PEG grant funding that made this podcast possible. Also, thanks to past and present staff of the Birmingham Museum, as well as our amazing volunteers.